Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing Saturn and its beautiful moon Titan, but I guess more specifically, a potential bizarre connection between Titan and the rings of Saturn itself. And specifically, we're actually going to be discussing some of the major discoveries from just the last few months that fundamentally challenge how we view this moon, but also how we view the rings of Saturn. And that's because for an extremely long time, this was assumed to be a kind of a stable system. Basically, we assumed that the moon was ancient, and so were the rings. But in just the last few years, it has already been confirmed that the rings of Saturn seem to be relatively young, at least in cosmic scales, possibly about 100 million years old or so. But we also now have evidence that maybe this moon is also young as well. And maybe there has been some violence in the past that resulted in the creation of the system. And so let's discuss this, I guess, secret life of Saturn, and let's start with the rings. Now, if you were to look at this through your backyard telescope, they would basically resemble a kind of a rim of a hat, and to some extent would look kind of timeless. They don't really change much over time, which is why for many years astronomers believed that maybe these existed for billions of years. However, in just the last few years, multiple lines of evidence now suggest that these seem to be kind of young, possibly as young as 100 million years old, and were possibly created by something when right here on Earth we had a bunch of dinosaurs dominating the planet. And so before that, Saturn might have been completely ringless. But in just the last few months, there's also been some additional mysterious discoveries that actually challenge our assumption about these rings again. And that's because previously researchers believed that these rings were also incredibly thin, actually about 10 meters vertically, and they actually do look thin in most of the pictures. But based on the more recent analysis of the data coming from the Cassini mission, and specifically the Cassini's grand finale, when it essentially crashed into the atmosphere of Saturn, here the data suggests that the rings seem to extend much further up and down than we can physically see. And specifically, scientists discovered a kind of a halo of tiny mineral particles floating approximately 100,000 kilometers above and below the ring. With all this reported in this study by Simon Lindy and the team you see here. And that makes Saturn's rings actually resemble a kind of a dusty donut instead of just a flat record, with these particles likely being created by very tiny space rocks or micrometeoroids smashing into rings at high velocities and vaporizing rock, creating the additional donut shape, with this plume of dust just being invisible because it's relatively thin and contains very small particles. And this is of course kind of important because this confirms that this whole system is quite dynamic and way more messy than we ever thought. And that's because previously the assumption was that these rings were somewhat orderly and stayed this way for a very long time. But because this was now discovered around Saturn, this is probably what's happening around other rings, including the ones in the Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune systems. So this is very likely a very common process. But now let's talk about Titan. We'll come back to these Saturn's rings in a few minutes. And that's because for over a decade now, the consensus was that Titan, the Saturn's largest moon, had a really massive global ocean of liquid water somewhere underneath. This was based on previous analysis, mostly involving the observations of how much the moon flexes because of Saturn's gravity, or basically how much it changes its shape as it orbits around Saturn. But a major reanalysis of Cassini data published in 2025, that as always you can find in a description, seems to turn this idea on its head, mostly because by using this new technique that focused on the reanalysis of the radio data, researchers discovered something that was previously not visible. A kind of a 15-hour lag in Titan's flexing. Okay, here's I guess how I can maybe explain this. Imagine stirring a pot of water versus a pot of honey. The honey responds much slower, whereas the water responds almost right away. And so here, because of viscosity, honey has a bit of a lag, and something similar seems to exist inside Titan, with the lag suggesting that the interior is not a liquid ocean, but instead something more viscous and something a lot more slushy. Possibly some kind of a highly pressurized ice. And so the slushy interior seems to be more efficient at removing heat, which may prevent a full ocean from forming. But interestingly, this study also suggests that if this is the case, it might dramatically increase the chances for life. And that's because a vast diluted ocean may not be able to circulate nutrients very well and thus prevent the life from forming or evolving. But a slushy object may contain pockets of warm water, with some of them reaching temperatures of 20 Celsius or 68 Fahrenheit. Although in this case it might be very close to the moon's core. And these pockets could act like some kind of a cryoecological niche, similar to many ecosystems we usually find very close to the Earth's polar ice. In other words, they would be completely isolated, but may contain viable ecosystems that would evolve for millions of years. Naturally though, at least for now, this is just an assumption, but the slushiness seems to be there. But because of its extreme conditions, including extreme temperatures and pressures, it may also have slightly different chemistry compared to what we thought it had. This was recently reported in this study by Fernando Esquerdo Ruiz and the team you see here. And while normally, at least on Earth, polar and non-polar substances don't really mix. This is why basically if you mix water and oil, oil tends to form these bubbles on the surface and does not mix with water. But surprisingly on Titan, molecules like hydrogen cyanide, which by the way is very polar, can actually mix with certain non-polar hydrocarbons like methane and ethane. And turns out that it can basically form what's known as co-crystals, with this discovery challenging the basic principle of chemistry of like dissolves like. This is something that I think most chemistry classes usually teach. And so in essence, Titan's geology, and specifically its sand dunes and its mountains, might be actually made out of chemical combinations we never even thought were possible. And that's of course because of its extreme conditions that just don't exist on Earth. And on top of this, in a separate study, researchers also discovered something known as acrylonitriles. This was discovered in the atmosphere, and it actually suggests if these acrylonitriles can combine with the methane rain on Titan, they can then form what we usually refer to as vesicles, hollow double-layered spheres that surprisingly look almost exactly like cell membranes on Earth. Now at the moment this was just a theoretical study, but if confirmed, it would essentially suggest that the building blocks of life may also form on Titan, assuming all of these acrylonitriles mix with the rain and are then deposited in the oily lakes. Which of course makes this particular moon just a little bit more exciting. But now it's time to discuss the most recent study that tries to combine the idea behind Saturn's rings with the moon Titan. And basically the question here is, why does the Saturn system look the way it does today? And so here let's discuss this potentially missing chapter that was never really considered before. This is based on this study by Matija Cook. I'm sorry, once again I'm going to have to bow to you for mispronouncing your name. Who focused on trying to analyze the orbit of the nearby moon known as Hyperion, and then figuring out why it's so bizarre. And while the thing is, based on its somewhat chaotic orbit, this study suggests that Hyperion may only be about 400 to maybe 500 million years old, not 4.5 billion years old as it was previously believed. And that's because it seems to have a very eccentric and a somewhat chaotic orbit that kind of tumbles around too much and should not have survived like this for billions of years. Which basically suggests that something chaotic and violent must have happened here to make the moon the way it is. And the explanation in this case seems to involve a major collision. It all starts approximately 400 million years ago, and it's quite likely that at this point Saturn had another moon. In this case it's referred to as Proto-Hyperion, although it's now unofficially also nicknamed Chrysalis. It was orbiting between Titan and Iapetus, but because Titan was migrating outward, and was doing so relatively fast, its gravity eventually destabilized this moon, possibly causing it to collide with Titan directly. And intriguingly, this collision was kind of similar to what happened to Earth 4.5 billion years ago as well, which eventually resulted in the formation of the moon. But in this case, Titan very likely swallowed most of this moon, which also resulted in a major resurfacing of Titan, and also explains why it seems to have so few craters on the surface. It basically explains why its surface seems to look so young. But the leftovers formed Hyperion. And then, for 300 million years, nothing major seems to have happened. But approximately 100 million years ago, the collision that left Titan in a slightly elongated orbit eventually destabilized some of the inner moons, once again causing some of them to crash into each other. And it was these violent collisions, very likely involving previous versions of moons like Rhea and Dione, that provided all of the material that eventually became Saturn's rings, with all of this basically then stabilizing for approximately 100 million years. And well, if confirmed, this of course changes all of our previous assumptions about this beautiful system. And that's because we used to think that planets and moons very likely were already formed approximately 4 billion years ago. But here Saturn suggests that in a typical planetary system, the evolution doesn't actually stop, and the collisions can still occur even in recent times. With this violent history even potentially explaining why Saturn is a little bit tilted, and why its rings are so bright and so young. But in this case, it may also explain why Titan seems to be so young as well, and why it even has such bizarre structure and very thick atmosphere, as well as such an unusual composition. And more importantly, why it seems to have liquid cycles. In this case, a lot of this activity might be the result of a somewhat recent collision. But this also potentially suggests that habitability is obviously not a permanent state. And so in this case, a moon could be some kind of a frozen wasteland for billions of years, and then, because of one collision, and because of an orbital shift, it suddenly transforms dramatically and starts to develop heat and chemistry required for life. And so for all we know, if this is actually true, Titan might be somewhat similar to what Earth was like 4.5 billion years ago, or to be more exact, 4 billion years ago, because it already had 400 million years to create something on its surface. And we know that for Earth, this was just enough time to form early life. But obviously none of this is going to be confirmed for quite some time, because NASA's Dragonfly mission, scheduled to launch in 2028, is only going to arrive to Titan in 2034. And so we're probably not going to have any answers for at least 7 or 8 years. But because this helicopter is going to fly across Titan's surface and is going to collect a lot of data, there's a very high chance we're going to have some answers within the next decade. For example, if it finds signs of massive collisions 400 million years ago, this may confirm this hypothesis and may suggest that Titan was indeed born as a result of fire and ice. That's your mandatory Game of Thrones reference. But moreover, this would also suggest that life on Titan is actually quite likely, assuming that it forms in a very similar way to how it formed on early Earth. But I guess until future studies or until future discoveries, that's at least for now all I wanted to mention. You can find additional studies about Titan and Saturn and additional videos in the description below. But at least for now, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else. Support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.